Hi, guys. So as the robot voice announced me, I do work at Idaho National Laboratory, and I do spend a large amount of my time doing threat intelligence. Now, threat intelligence is kind of an interesting thing because it's a lot easier to do threat intelligence after something bad happens because we can pull a lot of the data in from forensics events. The problem is, in order to make threat intelligence actually useful, it helps if you can provide some of those insights to organizations ahead of time. In a perfect world, threat intelligence is something that we use to better inform risk management decisions. So the hope is that we can use this data and organizations can have kind of more of a dynamic posture regarding threats. One of the big challenges here is ultimately we're not talking about very much data. At the end of the day today, you're going to hear from the author, Andy Greenberg, of Sandworm. And ultimately, a few years ago, we only had a couple of cases where we could see the full attack from beginning to end. Unfortunately, if you need to understand how these events occur in multiple places, you need to figure out where some of that other data can come from. There's a few places where we can do this. And as part of my job, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out if there's any threads I can pull from these other areas just to get a little bit more forward knowledge of what some of these threat actors are doing. A few years ago, I started following the zero-day market space. And more recently, I think it's really changed a lot, and so it's kind of grown my interest in this area. Before I came to the laboratory, I spent a lot of time trying to determine who was participating in this space, but a lot of the transactions occurred on a case-by-case basis. They were generally privately conducted, and they weren't very public. So the transactions were kind of limited in that sense. In the last few years, however, there's been this huge growth in public bug bounty programs, but also specifically, subclass here, the brokers. So you have the emergence of these brokers that are now purchasing these capabilities, and instead of participating in responsible disclosure, these organizations actually sell to third parties. So I was hoping that I could use some of this data to try and determine how, and kind of follow it from beginning, this initial request that's being published as a bug bounty, and then ultimately see that capability as it's being developed and shows up in the wild. Caveat here, of course, first of many probably, is that the cycle that I'm talking about probably is on the order of 6 months to 2 years. And so ultimately, I'm fairly early on in this process of trying to watch some of those transactions occur and evolve. There's another problem here, right, which is industrial control system technology, and bug bounties in particular, tend to be categorized based on the technology that's being used, not necessarily the application of a device. So if you consider something like an HMI, which may or may not have a vulnerability in it, this is something that in the bug bounty space, we'd actually more likely see classified under mobile technology. And so the fact that these bug bounties are broken down into these different categorizations means that I have to do a lot of evaluation of the data as it's coming in to try and determine exactly where each one of these bounties should sit. The other thing I will say is it's kind of for the purpose of this conversation, and because I only have 30 minutes, I've kind of abridged what has been a long-standing evolution in this marketplace. I tend to start looking around 2014, and specifically, probably more importantly, in 2015 with the emergence of Zerodium by Vulpen. Vulpen, interestingly enough, has participated in this space for a long time, not only as bug hunters themselves, but also as providing pay services to access to zero-day vulnerabilities. So Zerodium emerges in 2015. And by 2017, we have this really interesting case, which is they offer a temporary bounty. It's available for about 4 months, I believe, on a kind of an ad hoc request. Bounty goes up, they keep it up for a few months. Presumably somebody answered that request, and it gets taken down by the end of the year. In 2018, you kind of see this growth period. We also have crowdfunds show up on the space. And by 2019, they've actually surpassed Zerodium in terms of the total amount of money that we're talking about in the bounties. But this is kind of a diverse ecosystem. You heard probably earlier on Brian from ZDI talk about how they came into this space. And it's true since 2011, they have been purchasing ICS vulnerabilities. But it's more than just the providers that are purchasing these capabilities and then ultimately participating in responsible disclosure. You also have a number of the competitions, like the Pwn to Own that's going down just today here. You've got a number of organizations that come onto this space and then for whatever reason are no longer in existence. So it's really tricky to kind of watch how some of these organizations emerge and then disappear. I will point out a couple of ones if you're interested in getting involved in this, I guess. HackerOne and BugCrowd. So those are two organizations that ultimately try to create a crowdsourcing model so that individual independent researchers can work directly with these organizations that are interested in hiring their skills. That being said, I did spend some time looking at what is currently being offered, and in the industrial control system space, they're actually, most of those relevant organizations do it on an invitation-only basis. So you probably have to show your skills someplace else to be requested in. There's another thing here that's worth pointing out. Instead of we're not necessarily only talking about bug bounties. We're not only talking about vulnerabilities. What Zerodium and CrowdFence are purchasing are chains of exploitation. And so instead of just requesting a vulnerability and the proof of concept exploit, which is generally comes as a package deal, they are looking for a full chain, as an example, something like remote code execution on a device that results in local privilege escalation with or without sandbox escape. So you can kind of see how this fits together. And from an organization that might be interested in purchasing this as a capability, one of the advantages to this kind of approach is that these chains are a lot closer to being weaponized, ultimately allowing for the third parties that ultimately buy these capabilities to deploy them more quickly. More caveats. Generally speaking, I'm looking at a data set from 2015 to 2019. It's one I compiled myself. It's primarily based from organizations that are publishing specific vulnerability requests with the pricing information. The pricing information I'm looking at is generally maximum payouts, so I have to make some assumptions there. I actually don't know what people are paying at the end. I only know what the max bounty is. I also have not yet included anything from the hacking competitions. That's something I'm thinking about putting in. I wanted to include some of the crowdsourcing information, the bug crowds, et cetera. But ultimately, that information didn't appear very fruitful just because it wasn't very profitable in the ICS space. So the first thing you have to know when you look at this, besides the HMI example I talked about earlier, is Zerodium has kind of created an awkward division of their bounties. They talk about them in two broad categories, and this is a more recent invention from about 2017. Before that, they lumped all of their bounties about once or twice a year. They'd release them. In this case now, they've got these two primary categories, and they're fairly awkward in the sense that they're not probably a perfect description of the bounties in each one of these categories. But in my data set, which is about just under 400 individually requested bounties, we're talking about mostly servers, slightly over mobile technologies, with the caveat that mobile technologies is growing very quickly in the data set. And since it comes up later, the router information, interestingly, is tied in with the desktops and servers. Targeted operating systems. Because of the fact that these bounties are lumped together in groups, you can actually expand the data set to about 650-ish around there entries. Now, if you look at the distribution of this, it kind of, in terms of operating systems, it's fairly even, which is kind of an interesting point. I don't know if that was intentional or from the third-party perspective, if they haven't selected an area they want to focus on. But in general, it's interesting that it works out that way. The other thing that's worth pointing out is we're talking about a massive amount of money here. So you kind of heard about the Pwn to Own competition this morning here and how much money they're offering for each one of their vulnerabilities and their ODAs that are found. If you look at the full data set, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 million. Obviously, I don't know how many of those bounties, those payouts are being shared. I can't tell. I also don't know how much money has ultimately been given away. But it's just a massive quantity that we're talking about here. In case any of you want to change careers, or need a retirement plan. This is a very expensive opportunity for you, I guess, specifically in mobile technologies. You also notice that a lot of these vulnerabilities requests are appearing multiple times in the data set. The assumption here is that, working assumption, the initial boundary request goes out, it remains unfilled, and so it gets republished in the next iteration around. I actually wanted to include all the bounties that were over $1 million payouts, but they didn't fit on the slide. So this is what we're talking about. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this, because a lot of the bounty programs are really limited in terms of what data I have access to, is comparing these to events where other organizations, private organizations, have offered their own bounties. Thankfully, in 2018, retrospective, Google provided some data, merged both the Android and the Chrome vulnerabilities. Their single largest payout was $41,000 for 2018. You'll notice in 2018, CrowdFence and Zerodium offered 7 bounties for Chrome over $40,000. Similarly, if you consider BugCrowd's data from the same period of time, the average payout was just under $800. So if you were interested in going into this field, I probably wouldn't go into the crowdsourced options. Interestingly enough, BugCrowd did note that in 2018, I have that highlighted for you, 2.5% of the payouts for them were actually in IoT devices. So there is some interesting activity that's going on in the crowdsourced space. But ultimately, what are we talking about in terms of industrial control systems? ICS and SCADA is underrepresented in the data thus far, unfortunately for me. But we do know that there's some activity going on. In this case, ZDI can serve as kind of a good data point because they're more open about what they're buying. If you're at all interested in this, they do maintain a list of publicly accessible lists by year, and you can search the data set by vendor for all of the alerts. I've selected some Rockwell automation for you to view just from 2019. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that although they started in 2011, you're seeing a huge increase just in the last couple of years. In 2018, which actually was, I've looked at the data set, a slightly better year for ZDI buying SCADA than 2019. But in 2018, 30% of their payouts were for SCADA, as they identified them, SCADA vulnerabilities. In case you're curious, this is the data from 2019. It actually is not, you will see some overlap between what organizations appear in ZDI's data, but it's generally, there's a new winner every year. So if you're curious, I would suggest checking it out, but this gives a pretty good idea with Delta Automation and luckily SCADA. Those are pretty high, generally speaking, from year to year. In 2019, early part of the year, at a hacker conference, Manzoni, the CrowdFence founder, actually started talking about ICS-specific vulnerabilities that they'd already purchased for that year. It's kind of a limited data set, and it's very unfortunate that I obviously don't have all the specifics, but they definitely bought industrial control system vulnerabilities in 2019. So you start to say, what is this really going to look like? How are they dividing this? And given the fact that Zerodium, for example, doesn't have the most clean division of technologies and how they organize their bounties, I don't know if these were ICS things they requested or if these were things that came out of the woodwork. Other things that are perhaps more on the convergence of technology, IT, OT side, less specifically OT, there's a lot of things that fall into this area. One of my interest areas is actually the targeting of the routers, in part because it has this huge growth chart. This data is built, actually each one of these blobs on the screen encompasses more than one bounty, so that allowed for this development of this trend line. So you're looking at a pretty steep increase in terms of the size of the payouts since 2017. But what does this really mean? Well, we have a wonderful example, so I didn't have to come up with my own here. If you're unfamiliar with this, I suggest you read about it. But when you start saying, what is the usefulness of vulnerabilities? What is the usefulness of proof of concept exploits? This is the kind of thing we're talking about. So you heard a little bit earlier in the day about the bespoke development of physics payloads. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here. What we're looking at is more capabilities that could be purchased by third-party organizations to enable the development of the first part of their attack campaigns. We're talking about target reconnaissance. We're talking about access. We're not necessarily talking about attacking the process, which requires more development and more specific process information. In 2018, I always think this one's in 2019 for some reason. In 2018, VPN filter infects routers everywhere. You probably heard about it. But one of the things that wasn't, I don't think, emphasized enough was the fact that amongst other things, other targeting information this malware appeared to be collecting was determining whether or not it was infecting SCADA-specific networks. And it would record whether or not, once it was in an environment, if it saw any SCADA communications, that was a specific point it recorded. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about when we're talking about these capabilities that might allow for these broader campaigns. Mobile targets. As I've already alluded to, if you're interested in going to this field at all, if you need to make some money, the mobile target market is definitely the place to be. You can see here, at least in my data set, there's a huge jump between 2018 and 2017. And just the size of the payouts here, we're talking about around $40 million in terms of the total bounties. This actually isn't a new concept, the idea of mobile technologies existing in the OT space. There's actually some really great research by Embeddy and IO Active from a couple of years ago, 2017, that looked into the emergence or the increased prevalence, I guess I should say, of industrial mobile applications. Now, they found through a review 2 years going through all these, give you a picture of some examples, going through a bunch of these different applications, they found that in general, this probably is not going to come as a surprise to anyone here, but in general, the security was somewhat lacking in some of the applications. So as part of that, they did find a number of vulnerabilities which they thankfully provided as part of responsible disclosure. So I'm not necessarily saying don't use this technology. I'm saying be aware of what you're putting into your ecosystem. And because I don't want to be specific, this is a vendor agnostic presentation. There's examples across the board here. The last thing I kind of wanted to touch on, and perhaps a little bit more forward-looking than the other areas, the mobile technologies, is actual virtual machine exploitation. Now, virtual machine exploitation is something that has been an area of interest throughout the entire data set. Part of it is because of what I was talking about before, about these chains where you bring together different exploitation paths in the full chain and people are buying that feature. There's a big emphasis on all of the virtual machine escapes. But specifically, some of these VMware products are called out and have been since the beginning. The ranges here are pretty vague, pretty wide. We're talking about 50K, 500K. There's this huge gap. So I can't really make a guarantee about, I haven't been able to make any assessments about how that's growing or not. But it's something that exists if you're going into that virtualized environment. You're going to find that in almost every vendor case. So here's a GE example. Here's a Wonderware example. And here's a Honeywell example. I could keep going, but I didn't want to put them in because I wasn't sure if I was going to go over time. Ultimately, this is something that you're going to see more of if you haven't already adopted some of these solutions, just because of scalability features. Some of the advantages there, some of which were highlighted in the presentations yesterday. So what are we talking about here? Well, as you'll have noticed from this presentation, there's very limited data in terms of the ICS OT vulnerability market space. However, if we take as a data point some of the mobile areas, if we look at some of the other places and the growth over a 5-year period, the market writ large is growing. And so we can make some assumptions about what is going on in terms of the purchases. Ultimately, the scale of these purchases and these bounties is so large that it greatly dwarfs everything related to vendor-specific or service provider that I've heard of. There are some rumors of specific payouts that came to researchers that I guess would mirror some of the bounty amounts we've seen here, but the ones that are published and released, they're just on a different playing field. From an analysis standpoint, from threat intelligence, if you're interested in looking at this kind of data, it is very challenging because you have to basically pull back the layers on a bunch of different technologies to determine what bounties might be applicable across the board. So ICS OT bounties, until Zerodium or CrowdFence calls out specifically for those, it's kind of limiting. You have to figure that out on your own. And as I said earlier, threat intelligence is based on this concept that I can predict what's going on. I am not in forensics. Forensics is a related field. I sometimes use their data. But I'm trying to look forward, not back. And so some of what I'm pulling from is a lot of predicting what's going on here, trying to pull together those threads. You're not always correct in your assessments, but you use what data you can. Ultimately, one of the concerning features here, some of the other INL work has been focused on this, and even last year they talked about consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering. CCE, for example, is based on this idea that we can, if not predict what the most likely attack path is, what the most damaging one is. That's the first step when you're trying to figure out how to apply limited funds and resources, but it's not going to solve all of the problems. You have to know, besides which one's most damaging, which one's most likely. And that's where we want to try and pull in some of this data. The problem is, if threat actor capabilities can be augmented this quickly through a third-party market, then it's very difficult to understand what a normal trajectory of growth and capability should be over the long term. So I guess I don't have a solution to that. I like to end in a positive note, but I think unfortunately this is a more depressing presentation than I usually have. But the reality is, at least from the threat intelligence space, you have to be aware of that assumption that you're making. The capabilities can grow very quickly. Kind of an attempt here at prediction. Because we're talking about such limited data set, I can really, like I said, only compare against mobile technologies. Although the purple color here kind of is a notional representation of the ICS specific vulnerabilities that appeared in 2019, purchased by CrowdFence. There's ultimately, it remains a question. I don't know if the ICS space is going to be something that's going to be called out in future years, but if the mobile technology space is any indication, then it's something to be aware of at the very least. And so I finished a little bit early. So I guess I should have asked for questions during the presentation, but if you guys have any now, I'll take them.
Hey, Sarah.
Hey.
Thank you for the presentation. And just to try and pivot from the pessimistic view, there is at least one example of defensive bounty programs. Do you want to speculate whether that could actually happen in the ICS world?
So I think there's one other thing that I didn't say that's worth bringing up. So I've been looking at this, doing research at the lab around this area for a long time. A couple of years ago, unrelated topic, I actually spent a lot of time talking to researchers, cyber researchers who had participated in a lot of these programs, responsible disclosure, defensive focus programs. And in the course of my investigation, I got to conduct all these interviews. And one of the consistent complaints was that cyber researchers, even ones who had historically participated in vendor identification and bug bounty programs, they tended not to do it anymore. They generally had kind of negative experiences, and so it really discouraged them from participating. A number of them were concerned about the legal repercussions of what they were doing because they'd gotten kind of negative feedback from some of the vendors. So that being said, if you go into, I think it's BugCrowd, they actually have scores there where the various cyber researchers who have participated in vulnerability disclosure with the different companies, they've actually graded the companies to see whether or not they're safe havens or not for that kind of information. So I do think that I'm hopeful that there'll be more participation in the future. But it's funny because when you start talking about what people are interested in participating in, it's the money, the difference in the money is just so significant that I know a lot of people are actually considering participating in this just because of the scale. I mean, it's a different world in terms of those payouts.
So you brought up an interesting comment here when you said that based on, the experiences that some of the bug bounty researchers had, the negative experiences about them crossing lines into something, where companies might say, hey, that's illegal, you can't do that, you're going to get into trouble for that. I mean, do you see an effort around maybe in the government or the community where somebody's stepping up or the government is stepping up and putting initiatives together that say, hey, for programs like Bug Bounty that actually benefit everybody, maybe the legal standards or the legal analysis of these cases should be handled differently, right? Maybe it should be encouraged.
Yes. I think that, and one of the things I forgot to highlight earlier on, I think part of the reason why some of these programs are so attractive, in spite of the fact that there's like a lot of money on the table, is actually that these brokers, CrowdFence, Zerodium, they serve as anonymity protection for the cyber researchers who are participating in the sale, just like they serve anonymity protection for the organizations that are buying the vulnerabilities. So when you start saying, like, is there a way we can learn from this to improve some of the other items? I don't suspect anybody's willing to offer the same degree of payouts, at least on the government side, but ultimately, I do think there's something to be said for maybe introducing an anonymous option.
All right, thank you, Sarah.
See you guys later.